We're going to pick up the lecture now, starting with claim rights and liberty rights. We're going to be mostly looking at the perspective of the political philosopher Peter Jones. I want to make sure you all understand that what we're doing here is setting a foundation of the particulars so we have some way of assessing what we're going to do further down the road. So here, Jones defines claim rights as consisting of being owed a duty. Okay, I have a claim right. Okay, think of it in terms of, he used the example of education, right? I can make a claim that I deserve that right. So it's a claim right. Being owed a duty by something or someone else would be a claim right. So it's something that one holds against another person or people who owe a duty to the right holder. I've got this right. You have a requirement or a duty to supply that. So Jones identifies the necessary distinction with the concept of a claim right when he distinguishes between a positive claim right and a negative claim right. Okay, so basically the idea of a claim right is holding some right or some specific good or service which someone has a duty to provide. All right, you have a claim right. I have a duty to supply that, right? So you have a positive request that your claim be met by me in the college that has a duty to provide that. Okay, so someone that has a claim right obviously has a specific good or service that they have a right to, and somebody else has a duty to provide. A negative claim right is just the opposite of that equation. Those are rights that one holds against others that interfere with or trespass upon the life or the property in some way. Okay, so you have this positive claim. You owe me a duty, and there is a negative claim right, and that is it's the rights that one holds against others that interfere with their right. Okay. All right, so Jones identifies within the concept of claim rights held in personam and rights held in rem. One deals with property, right, and the other deals with those things which are not property rights. Rights held in personam are rights one holds some specific identified duty holder. Education is an example. Rights held in rem are rights held against no one in particular. So think of personam as a person. Right? In rem are rights held against no one in particular, but apply to everyone. Okay, I mean, everyone has to respect that right. All right, Jones further goes on to define liberty rights as rights which exist in the absence of any duties not to perform some desired activity and thus consist of those actions one is not prohibited from performing. In contrast to claim rights and liberty rights, they're primarily negative in character. What this means is liberty rights, there's no duty. You have them. They're fundamental, if you will, rights. And no one owes you a duty because those rights already exist and are yours to exercise. Right? Education, and you'll see that usually this institution has provided these rights. Education, someone owes you that. These rights we're talking about now, liberty rights, you have them. No one has a duty to provide them. You have them, and those rights have to be respected. All right. So a liberty right can be said then to be a right to do as one pleases, precisely because one is not under an obligation grounded in others' claims rights to refrain from acting. A liberty right is something you can do that is not subject to a claim right. Right? Someone says, "Well, you have to provide this." Basically, you have that right based on your own will and based on these liberty rights. So the example given, whether you're a multimillionaire or a vagrant, he says, both possess an equal liberty right to a holiday in the Caribbean each year. You have a right to do it. The old saw is that neither rich man nor poor man may sleep under bridges at night, but the rich man doesn't have to. But here you've got an example of the difference between the two. Yes, you both have an opportunity, and no one has to give you that right to go to the Caribbean, but fundamentally there are things that interfere with the person that's the vagrant from doing that, but nevertheless they have a right to do it. It's a liberty right. We're going to talk about substantive categories of human rights now. Again, I'm trying to follow how this is laid out in the reading, because you have to read it and you have to fill in some of the particulars that we're not going over, not because they're not important, but because I want to emphasize or accent those things which are fundamental, and we're building the nature of human rights on top of, or with support of. All right, different categories of substantive human rights exist, right? Okay, these are as follows. Rights to life, right? Right to freedom, tough one to define. Right to political participation, okay, dictatorships don't have that. Rights to the protection of the rule of law. Rights to fundamental social, economic, and cultural goods. I want to spend time on this because this is really the focus of what we're most interested in, okay? Right to life. So let's talk about that. Remember that people come together to form societies, and the attendant culture that flows from that, language and so on and so forth, because they want to survive. That means if you're going to come together, not only should you come together to protect oneself from others, but that this idea of a right to life is fundamental. Everyone has a right to survive. This goes back to natural law and all that. So the right to life doesn't mean that, for example, the governing structure can't take that life from you. But there is a rule of law, which we're going to get to, which dictates that there's a process for that. Because the individual has so seriously violated a fundamental rule that individual now can be separated from society. Now, think about the death penalty. Not everyone agrees that the death penalty is a good thing. I would, in, again, full disclosure, I don't believe the death penalty really serves any purpose, right? I'm not saying life imprisonment does either, but I think that the death penalty doesn't really, serve any purpose, because we know that in states that have the death penalty, it doesn't curb people from, the number of people that are killed each year. So the idea is that the punishment is supposed to, or the threat of it, is supposed to control or order or reshape individual behavior. If the death penalty is not doing that, then what is the purpose of it? Is that person going to commit further crimes against humanity and the like in the society? If they are, then taking them and putting them away for life, so they're removed from society, would have the same effect. In fact, it can, in neither case, going away for life or being executed, those two things don't bring back the life that's been taken. But that's not possible. And while there is some measure of retribution and the like, at the end of the day, what we're interested in is influencing human behavior and respecting and honoring everyone's rights, especially the right to life. Right now, it's not just someone taking your life, the right to life, right? It's really about sustaining oneself, right? Your life cannot be, as I mentioned before, have a fundamental opportunity to be a good life if your life is not protected in some way, right? All right, so the right to life, I think everyone can agree on, is universal in nature. We're going to get down to universality in a bit. But fundamentally, it's a right to life. If you take away the right to life, really none of these others really matter, right? In fact, one or two of these, as we'll discuss, actually support this right. So other rights support this right. And I would argue the right to life is so fundamental that we almost can just accept it on face value. We don't have to explore it any further. That's not the case for a lot of philosophers who have looked at this. Nevertheless, I think that that's where we can start as political scientists. The next one is rights to freedom. Now, here again, what freedoms? How do we define those freedoms? Those freedoms must be governed by something. When we have a blanket rule that everyone has a right to be free, what does that exactly mean? I would argue that that is very difficult to define, and it's something that societies really have to sort of come to in some way. What is a right? Right to freedom. What does freedom mean? Is it the right to do whatever you'd like to do whenever you'd like to do it? And the answer is no, because in the exercise of your freedoms, if it limits the freedom of others, is that acceptable? Or do your right to act freely, live freely, and where they infringe upon the rights of others to live? So the right to freedom is fundamental because it does allow you to have some control over your life and make a determination about what you'd like to do, how you'd like to do it, when you'd like to do it, if you want to do it at all, whatever that may be. You want to protest, fine. You have the freedom to do that. Question is how we define what's an effective protest in terms of the rights or not. All right, then we come to the rights to political participation. This is interesting. I think the West believes that a representative form of government in some way allows people to politically participate. Well, it's about the form and function of that participation that we're most interested in. For example, in the United States, we don't vote directly. We vote directly for our state representatives and for our legislative representatives of the federal government. But there's no direct vote for the President of the United States, right? There's Electoral College. It's state by state, and depending, in some states have said that the Electoral College has to mirror the popular vote and so on and so forth. And the argument for the Electoral College is that, well, if we didn't have it, small states would have less say. Now, or would be ignored altogether. Now, why is that important? Why would that matter? You'd have to say a couple of things. One, state by state, things are different. And they are in some measure, right? You would have to say that the aggregate of the votes in a given state added to the aggregate of votes in another state as we move across the country during a federal election, and I'm talking about the president here. That's where the Electoral College comes in, only for the president. People in, let's say, red states or blue states, Democratic states or Republican states, if you are a Republican in a Democratic state, you know that the president that you're voting for, the Republican, your state's electors are not going to go to that person unless that state has a rule that the electors are divided up. It's not a winner-take-all. If it's a winner-take-all, then your voice is muted. If it's not a winner-take-all, the Electoral College is less problematic and serves its purpose in terms of giving smaller states somewhat more say than they would otherwise have. So when we think about it, if you don't have an electoral college breakdown by every state where it represents the actual number in popular vote. So if you get 30% of the popular vote, you should get 30% of the electors for that state, right? And the total number of electors is based upon the 2 senators and the number of representatives you have, which is based on population, which makes sense in that structure, in terms of how you would offer up or create these electors. And there's a bit more calculation that goes into that, but fundamentally that's what we're looking at. So if you had, at least with the Electoral College, representative government and the electors based upon the popular vote, then you could take the 30% popular vote that garnered so many of the electors and add those to other states. So it would be possible then for someone running for the presidency to win some states garnering a majority, right, of those electors. And as you add them across the country, someone's going to win. With a winner-take-all, you're actually minimizing the voice of those people in red states that voted Democratic, but it doesn't count as a winner-take-all, or in the alternative. So I've mentioned before in the subject, full disclosure, that I think the Electoral College needs to be dealt with in that way. It's got to be representative, I think, based on the percentage of the popular vote. That gives everyone in that state a fair amount of say in who becomes president. If you just go with the popular vote across country, which I also am, I think there's an argument for. I think the weakest argument is for the Electoral College winner take all state by state. So if you talk about just the popular vote going across the country, that would also be valuable because you're adding those people whose voice may be muted in a state. So let's just say we do away with the Electoral College, and there is a state that has more Democrats than it does Republicans. There are other states that may have more Republicans than Democrats. As you move across the country, again, in the aggregate, you're going to have, the one person, one vote. You're going to have a popular vote. You think about states, and the argument, I think, in part is, well, how do those states really differ so much that the federal government somehow needs to be the presidency, not even the federal government, but the presidency needs to somehow be divvied up in a certain way. I think there's very little argument for the Electoral College in that way. Lots of people disagree with me. All right. The next one's really important. The right to protection, the rule of law. Just go back to the rights to political participation. Participation can take any number of forms, right? Not just in terms of Electoral College and that sort of thing. Political participation could be not voting at all, which is one type of political participation. It's the one that creates people that get into office. But political participation could be based upon, going out and actively seeking votes for that person. It could be nothing more than forming an organization that then, wants to go in and lobby Congress to change some law or create some law. Political participation could be any number of things. It could be local participation and not national participation. It could be national participation, but not local participation. It may be lobbying and nothing else, right? It may be donating money to campaigns, and that's it. We always tend to think of political participation as being voting. And I think in large measure we do that because it's the one thing that appears, at least, to have an outcome that we can measure. I voted for this person, for the state assembly, whatever, and they won. Or I voted for president and they won. Or I voted for, a senator and they won. I think all of those things make people feel, like that is the form of participation that's most important. Well, if you have money and you can run ads for or against, so long as you don't orchestrate a particular candidate, then you're going to influence votes. Think today of Google and Facebook and the like providing information or not providing information so you can change the sort of playing field is a major way of participating. Many would argue a corrupt way when you start controlling information people get, so they're forming their opinions politically and otherwise based upon those perceptions. Well, those perceptions are going to be skewed, right? Or just not having a intermediary institution, which is what the media was, making sure that they don't advocate, that they're nonpartisan, even though they have individually their own, points of view, that the media should remain somewhat neutral. Now, think about the Supreme Court. We always want those that are put on the court to not vote necessarily their personal point of view. Now, and we can argue this, but there's a rationale for this, right? And here's what I think is the most important. If you have statutes that are going to be interpreted, if you have the Constitution, it's going to be interpreted. But we have a right to expect that those interpreting it will do their best to try and get at the core of what that statute or constitutional provision was intending to do, and then try and decide the case based on that, not personal preferences. Now, that's difficult to do because people have points of view, and those points of view influence how they process information. Yes? And so, given the same fact pattern to someone who has a liberal bent, and given the same fact pattern to those that have a conservative bent, you can't take their personal perspective on things out of that equation. It's very hard to do because they're filtering the information through their personal perspective. So is there a reason to be concerned about putting a justice on the court that may have a liberal or conservative personal perspective, and because you're concerned that that might filter and create an outcome that you may not be in favor of? But here's the argument. If you believe that a conservative is going to do that, or someone that holds conservative views once they're on the court, then you also have to believe that about liberals or a liberal perspective when they're put on the court. And when you think about that, if they could all keep their own personal perspective out of it, which I don't think is possible, I think you see the world through what you believe it should be. Now, they would argue that when you're reading law, you look at past cases and that sort of thing, and you want to be consistent. That's all well and good, but it's very hard for most people to put aside their perspective and look at the facts and not interpret them in light of that perspective. So I think it's a reasonable concern that the court, any court, is going to look, because it's justices, or one, or an appellate court, more than one, that are going to look at this, of the fact pattern, and they're going to interpret things in a different way. And if they do that, then are we really being consistent? And so when we talk about, the rule of law, the rule of law is really critical to a free society. It means everyone gets treated equally. It means there's a process, right? Because if you look at the Bill of Rights in the United States Constitution, really the first two, and the second one is up for a lot of debate and concern by certain groups and political party. But the first one just lists those fundamental rights. Yes? And so you have a right to do those things. But after the second, the rest of those rights are really about protecting individuals from the government. And you'll see why that's important as we move on to lecture today. But protecting themselves from the government. And the way you get protected from the government is there is a process that the government must follow if the government is going to say you broke, you violated some law, some statute, some regulation. And that means you have to have the same access to the courts, and you get the same process and same procedure. You can't violate the procedure, and if you do, the government does, then there's an argument for appeal. Everyone gets treated the same, right? Everyone gets read their rights. So the rule of law is critical. Honoring contracts, the whole nine, all of that, although it's not protecting you from the government in the Constitution, it talks about people having a right to patents, for example, right, and copyrights. The government then has to enforce that. And there's a purpose behind that. You want people to have a right to their own labor, and be able to benefit from that, at least for a time. If you take away the right to possess your property, which is that book you wrote, or that medicine you came up with, or that great invention that creates a way of something happening. How's that for something that's totally nondescript? Whatever it may be, a pet rock. It doesn't matter. You're protected. You have a right to that, because if you don't protect that right, what's the incentive for people to come up with new ideas, to make things better or more interesting, or the like? There's no reason to do that, or very little reason to do it. Now, while it's true that others that have power can take your patent and you can't fight them, because even though you have access to the courts, they can bury you with lawyers. That's a practical problem, but you do have the right. Now, the government should protect that right and try and keep the money out of it, but you have a freedom to use your resources to advance your own interests. So there are conflicts here. And so the courts have to decide, even under the rule, how the rule gets applied. Now, we know what the purpose of the copyright and the patent is. We know why it was in the Constitution. We understand that. It's exactly what I just said. But now, how do you effectively apply that or enforce it, it runs into other rights, and then those rights get weighed, right? If you think about it in those terms, you realize how complex this becomes. Something that's so obvious as the rule of law, right? It comes down to who has the resources to effect that end. So someone commits a crime, they get 20 lawyers on it. Okay, the government then has to decide: do we want to prosecute this? How many resources, or how much do we have to, earmark or what have you for this particular problem? Or is it just easier to make a compromise of some sort with the offending party? And it makes more sense if, say, it's a corporation and they're violating some federal law that's supposed to protect people or what have you, and they say, well, we're going to put 30 lawyers on this. The government, the Department of Justice, do they have 30 lawyers to put on just this one particular case? And the answer is no. So now what do? They cut a deal. Now, if it's just you, there's no need to cut a deal. You don't have the resources to put 30 lawyers on this, so you'll comply. If you think about tax law, for example, there's also a rule of law around that. There are statutes that are written, right, in tax law, and it's okay in terms of taxes tax avoidance is fine. You've got the rule, it says how things work, and you use that rule to avoid paying taxes or to minimize, the tax bite. However, if you say someone is trying to avoid paying taxes, we accept that they're using the law. To evade taxes means you know what the law is, you don't qualify to sort of not pay taxes based on that, and so you don't. Now that's tax evasion. You owe the taxes and you're evading the rules. So avoidance is fine. So people always have an issue, I think, with the rich or major corporations especially, not paying any tax. The truth is they follow rules. A lot of these major companies take their money and put it offshore. And then they claim that all of their costs occur here. So they make no profit here. And they make all their profit in some other country. So the U.S. is not entitled to any tax dollars. Can we argue with that? Yeah, we can't really. Why? There's the law. And they're using the law to benefit themselves. And these major organizations, they have tax lawyers, accountants that, set this all up for them and they make it work. I mean, Florida has no state income tax, at least right now, right? So if you're very wealthy, you can own a home in Florida and you don't have to even go to that extent, but home in Florida and say, that's your legal residence, that's where I pay property taxes and the like. So long as you're there a certain period of time during the year, you can claim that as your official sort of home. So you're worth billions of dollars, you're making a ton of money, and you're paying nothing in state income tax. Is that legal? Yes. Is there something fundamentally unfair about that? Yes. But no one says the law has to be fair. It just has to be consistent. So yes, people take the laws that seem very clear. There is the rule of law that protects people from the government. But the way we interact with each other may not seem fair. You've got a secretary. Warren, Buffett said, my secretary pays more in income tax than I do. And the government's response was, then why don't you just pay more taxes? And his response was, because the law allows me not to. Which means make her tax burden lighter by giving her the opportunity to not have to pay taxes on her full salary, to be able to write things off so she can reduce the tax bill. Nevertheless, the rule of law is the rule of law, and even though you don't like the statute and you see that Congress perhaps did that statute to benefit those people that support their campaign or the like, then that's just the way it is. In fact, there's so much money now that those elites that have it, they don't typically, they may outwardly support one candidate, but they oftentimes give money to both candidates. The idea is you both got money from me. So whoever wins, I win. But if you don't do, what I hope and expect you to do, then next time you're not getting any money from me. I'll give it all to the other side. So think about that. Giving money to both candidates, because no matter who wins, they're beholden to you in some way. So when we look at the rule of law, it becomes very, very dicey, and all of these things do. But the rule of law is something where sort of the rubber meets the road, where people's, rights, to appeal to the law is important, but the law doesn't necessarily always support what may seem fair or right, moral to us, or what have you. Then there's the right to fundamental social, economic, and cultural goods. There's all kinds of social, economic, and cultural goods. We tend to really focus on economic goods. But social goods, cultural goods are things that have some value to people in the society. A social good is the right to do something, some activity that has some social value. Economic, I think, is pretty well explored, and I think everybody has a decent understanding of that, but we're going to come back to it because it's the one thing that stands out. Cultural goods. In America, for example, different cultures come together, and they get different things. But the idea is that whatever those goods are, all cultures in the United States should have access to that. But economic is really important. The one thing we don't like to talk about in America is class. We don't like to talk about that. We don't like to point a finger at it and say that's really the problem. And when I say we, I mean the elites. They keep people pretty well divided based on gender or race or some other demographic that they can use to set one against the other. But if you look at people that, if you take those various divisions that are made between people, whether it's race or what have you, and you look at those that it's the stratification based on economic, well-being, it doesn't really matter if you're poor white, poor black, poor, brown. It doesn't matter. Poverty is poverty. And I would argue that the only real color is green. If you have enough money, then it really, the things that the elites tell us divide us go away. A lot of money takes away whatever people, think that don't have that money are the real issues. So what I'm saying here is very simple. If you have, let's just say, because the most prominent one and one that's talked about the most is, black and white. Okay. Take for a second and say, okay, we know there's a disparity, right, in the path forward, and there are things, you can get into systemic racism and all of that. And not to give that short shrift, but what I'm trying to say is, if you look at the people that are most vulnerable to that, it's people that don't have a lot of money. Economic well-being gives you more power. You can't legislate into the hearts and minds of people what is not there by nature and nurture. Nature and nurture change over very long periods of time. The legislative process is to try and help that along by creating an environment where the ability to do certain things is minimized, right? And so the hope is that over a period of time, that there will be change, and that people will see things differently. And those things which are such a force for not for good, for evil or for bad, people begin to see that that's what they are, and those things change. Now, for people that are alive at that moment, telling them that doesn't really do them any good. You can't say, listen, in 80 years, this is all going to be okay. We're going to resolve it. We're going to know what we're doing. It's not going to be an issue anymore. That person says, look, I'm 20. I'll be dead in 80 years. So what you're saying is my whole life, I have to suffer under this because we can't change it. Again, you can't legislate into the hearts and minds of people what is not there by nature and nurture, but you can contain it. So you can say you can't have discrimination based on that. And you could prosecute those cases. And you can let the rule of law sort of guide that. But that's a process, and people have to know that process exists, and attorneys have to be willing to engage that process and try in some way to mitigate it, to sort of address it and make it better or begin to resolve it. Look, the problem for all of us is we're short-run beasts, right? We're looking at 70, 80 years. If we're lucky, maybe 90 years. So, we see this much of life, and this is our reality. And rightfully so, right? This is our reality. But the reality of the human experience and the human endeavor is this. It takes that much time. It takes that much, right? But we only see a slice of it. So it's understandable that we want in our time for these things which negatively impact us to go away. But the idea of class is a tough one. It's always been around. And if you can set those that they're not elites against each other, they're distracted with that. It doesn't mean it's not real, but that certainly keeps them looking at each other and seeing a difference between them and the other based on something that doesn't really or shouldn't really be a rationale for any difference, right? And that's what you try and get rid of. It shouldn't matter the color of your skin. It shouldn't matter your gender. Rights are rights, and human beings all deserve those rights. And violations of those rights need to be challenged and need to be eradicated, again, through, in Western society, through legislation and then enforcement of that. So something may exist that needs to be removed. And the idea is it needs to be removed now. And the truth is, yes, it does. It absolutely needs to be removed now. The process for doing that takes time. No one wants to hear that. And I understand why no one wants to hear that, because you need to resolve it now. No one should have to suffer under a particular societal norm. It needs to be changed. The question is, how do you do that in a shorter period of time so those that are alive now benefit immediately from it by eradicating that injustice? How do you do that and not create perhaps another injustice or actually make it worse because those that have to change so quickly somehow feel put upon? No one says, oh, there's a law about that now. That makes sense. I should just change the way I feel. It doesn't mean that the way some people feel is destructive and harmful and bad. My point is that looking to change those things is difficult, but the one thing we can change in the short run are economic rights. But those economic rights are really tied to social norms. In other words, we know that the more education you have or the more skill you have, it's not just college, right? It's trades. The more experience and education you have in the trades or in college, that sort of thing, trade school or college, that the likelihood of you doing better financially, economically goes up. Not everybody wants to start a company and hire 300 employees eventually. People want to, make a better living. So they'll say, okay, I really like this field, or, my parents did this and I'm going to take the family business and expand it or what have you. But the more you know, the more control you have and the more opportunity you have, which means this really comes down to education. Economic well-being is more likely if you're educated. You have more of an opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean, people like to talk about the anomaly. Well, Bill Gates didn't finish college. Correct, he didn't. But that's the anomaly. That's not the norm. And most people, because it's the norm, fit into that. So that means we have a fundamental responsibility, right? Positive, good. People should expect the education. And the education should be equal across the board. And it's not. You go to poor neighborhoods, I don't care what race lives there, okay? Poverty means you're not getting access to those things which will provide you the tools for economic well-being in the future. Now, everyone likes to talk about the anomaly, the person that came from nothing, whose family lived, in poverty, and they're successful. That's fantastic. We wish everyone could do that. But when you look at the number of people that do that, it's relatively small. And those people that really succeed, it's even smaller in terms of, have more wealth. So education is important. It enriches the life and all of that. And so, and the opportunities I've just said. So when you have a governing body that doesn't do that, doesn't give you a shot at getting up on the playing field of economic well-being, it's fundamentally unfair. Everyone should have the right to get the tools to climb up onto the field of opportunity. And if it doesn't come, it doesn't come. But you have a right to be there and try. A lot of life is about luck. Can't control that in the structure of moral rights and the like. And because most of life, and I mean most of it, is based upon luck, what that means, and you can't control that, by any means, all you can do is have people prepared to take advantage if the winds of fortune blow their way. I like to say that if the gates of fate budge an inch, you have to be ready to get through. And once on the other side, you're in a much better position to live a more protected, from the vagaries of life, more opportunity. But there are a lot of people that have that same talent that are just sitting outside those gates, and as those gates of fate open up and they try and get through, they close on them. That's the luck of it. You really can't expect that that everyone gets through. Now, those that get through somehow think it's somehow appropriate, or ordained because they got through. It was meant to be. It helps them sort of rationalize why they're there. But luck is a big part of it. And I just want to take a minute, because when we talk about economic rights and we talk about cultural goods and all of that, you have to understand that it is about class. Opportunity gives some people, right, that have succeeded, in terms of economics, more opportunities, right? It gets easier. But think about how much you really have control over. And this is why rights are so important, because we have control over very little of our life, and we want to make sure that we're protected in a way that allows us to have a fundamentally decent life. That's why we come together, as I've said 1,000 times, in a society. But take for a second, all the things you have control over, right? Because we believe in America, you can be anybody you want to be. And I would argue that's probably not true. Okay, I think there's a lot of people that make an effort and they're not exactly where they want to be, right? Relatively new to the scene of all these singing shows, The Voice and all that. You hear all these people with fantastic voices. One wins and may go on to have a career. All those other people that had that incredible talent don't get an opportunity. The gates of fate opened. They were outside of it. They didn't get through. But the talent is still there. So think about it. You have no control over the genetic pool that you have to live with based upon your parents. Maybe they don't have, certain skill set in their genetic pool that get passed along. Okay? So you have no control over that. You have no control over your parents and what they place an emphasis on. You have no control over where you're born, what part of the country, what nation you're born in. You have no control over any of that. You have no control over your intellectual grit, over your natural, talents. It's people that have made, great livings in the arts or in sports. They have ability that's been granted to them, and they have worked on it, and the gates of fate budge, and they got through. If you're a great athlete, yes, there's some measure of effort to that, large measure, because you have to take those raw skills, but those raw skills are there. No matter how much I might try in the past to be a great basketball player, the things that I need in my physical structure to do that, I'm not just talking about height, I'm talking about eyes, I'm talking about a whole host of things, are not there. Now you think about those things aren't there. You think about the parents there, the nation you were born into, the genetic pool that you have no control over. Now you think about the moment in time you're born. If you're born in the wrong era, Barack Obama, born 100 years ago, would not be president, would not have been president. That's the time, right? That's one of the key things. And he had no control over that, right? No control over that. His intellectual grit, some of it's inherited. Then opportunity to sort of work through things. You can't argue the level of intelligence. But then it's also the moment in time. It's, you take away television, things really change. You take over the internet, things really change. Take it away, rather. So all those things, become factors. Then, on top of all of that, you have to have the will to do it, and the interest in it, and the ability to affect those outcomes. And with all of that, the only thing you really have under your control is the effort, and it doesn't necessarily bring anything. We like to believe that you can be anyone you want to be. That's not true. I had a student once that said to me, "You can," and I said, "Give me an example." He said, "Well, I like basketball." I said, "Okay," and he said, "And every day, or pretty much every day, I go out and I play." I said, "Okay." He says, "And I jump higher and higher, over a period of months and that sort of thing. And if I keep doing that, I'm going to eventually be able to, jam the ball. I'm going to be able to, get above the rim. It's just a matter of time." And I said, by that rationale, if you keep at it long enough, you're going to be able to jump over the moon. You have physical limitations to your ability to jump or to shoot or whatever it may be. It's not to say that people that do it don't have talent. What I'm saying is the physical structure and ability and desire and opportunity were there, right? Look, before baseball as an example, where you had integration, right? People were watching whites and blacks play. That was it. Jackie Robinson, right? You now introduce that, and people see it, and they say, "Wait a minute, we're missing out on all this talent we could have seen." And it's rough in the beginning. It was very rough. But the point is that at that moment in time, it didn't exist. It was a transition of that moment in time, because of Jackie Robinson and others, that things began to change. That's a moment that no one has control over. So what I'm trying to say here is that the economic opportunity and the social and cultural goods are a function of all of those things, and we don't have that opportunity. People that come, that are just born in, as an example, into a class, economic parents that are economically well off, they're going to have opportunities that you don't get. Some great educational institutions like Harvard, they'll look at someone's parents that went there, and they'll say, "Okay, well, your kids can come here." If you have enough money, those top schools will send people to your house to talk to you, to try and convince you to send your child to their school, because they know you'll donate money. No one's coming, and no one came to my house to convince me to go anywhere, or my parents to send me somewhere at all. Now, if my parents were wealthy, I get that opportunity. And whether or not I was able to hold up under the rigors of that education didn't matter. Did not matter. Opportunity was there. Opportunity was there, and it presented itself. Okay? So when we talk about that, it's really important to understand that we talk about these rights, right to life, liberty, claim rights, and that sort of thing, that they're a function of that moment and how we came to that moment and what that moment encompasses and what we bring to that genetically and so on and so forth. Now, I want to be really clear about this. I'm not saying that genetics rule the day. What I am saying is it's a component part, right? If mom or dad or somewhere in the lineage, there, the genealogy going back, there was someone, just because of the way the DNA worked, had the capacity to speak 7 languages. No one else did. You're born, that gets passed on, and you have no problem speaking 7 languages. Well, you had a predisposition to it. It doesn't mean, by the way, that we all just give up and say, well, what can I do? This is the way it is for me. No, the society has to give you opportunity to maximize your talents, right? And for you to recognize your talents and use them to the best of your ability, and then protect that. And if those things don't garner you a better life, there should be some fundamental rights that allow you to get there. That's what we all want. If we all knew where we were going to end up, we'd be able to make more informed decisions today and change our course. Right? Nobody decides, I really want to be in abject poverty, discriminated against, and have a miserable life, not have medical care, and suffer a long and painful life with a painful death. I can't wait to experience it. No one says that. And it's sane, right? Doesn't make any sense. So the point here, although it's philosophical, is that this thing, when we talk about these rights and we take this, sort of philosophical approach up front in the class, is not to get people lost in the mental machinations of what this is all about, but to understand that this has real applicability, and we're wrestling with the ideas. And it's important to keep wrestling with the ideas because we perfect them. We get better at it. It moves us a little bit further down the road, but it takes a long time. And again, nobody wants the long time, that long term. It's perfectly understandable. No one says, you know what, my great-great-grandchildren are going to have that benefit. You want it now, and you have a right to it now. And had they done this 100 years ago, you'd have it. It's very, very difficult, right? All right, so keep in mind that these rights are very important and not necessarily easily defined or what have you. So let's talk about the scope of human rights duties. See, that's the problem. Not the problem, but that's the functional reality. When you bring together a society and you create all of this, there's a duty, especially by the institutions created in that society, to meet these important, freedoms, to ensure them in some way. And it gets even more difficult when you're not just talking about a particular nation, but about the international body, of nations, right? And about government bodies that crop up out of it, intergovernmental bodies. So you've got the international sphere, you've got domestic sphere, you've got domestic governance, and you've got international governance dealing with sovereign nations that all have different cultures, different languages, not all of them, but you understand what I'm saying. There are different languages, different paths to the present. Those nations have, not necessarily all had the same path to the present, right? So there's a whole mix there. Now we're expanding. It's very simple. We're expanding the number of people and the number of political structures that we're trying to bring together and create some sort of fundamental, hopefully more than fundamental, human rights, okay? And a key element when you bring government in now is this idea of duty. The purpose of government, again, is to offer these things and to keep the society intact. That means the government has a duty to affect those things. So when you get domestic governance, it's dealing with a smaller piece of the pie. International governance becomes much more complicated because there are many more elements that go into this. So the idea of securing rights typically falls on national governments and international or intergovernmental bodies. That's typically where it falls because they're the ones that can be most effective. You get Thomas Polk, who is a philosopher, and he argues that the moral burden for securing human rights should fall disproportionately upon such institutions precisely because they are best placed and most able to effectively perform the task. Why? Because having these rights means someone's got to define them, protect them, adjudicate them, and institutions are set up for that. Right? You can't expect individuals to do that. So these institutions are set up, and these institutions are designed to affect those ends. That being the case, it disproportionately falls on them. So those institutions, we don't want them to falter. We don't want them to corrupt. We want them to stay on point, and we want them to execute in a way that's consistent with these ideas of human rights and fundamental dignity and all of that. So when you think about things like the United Nations and the World Bank and World Health Organization, other things, other international bodies, we're talking about a form of governance. All right, so one might wish to argue, for example, that human rights can be adequately secured by the existence of reciprocal duties held between individuals across the globe. Individuals come into the play now. However, privatizing human rights, waiting for individuals to do this, right, in this fashion would ignore two particularly salient factors. First, individuals have a tendency to prioritize the moral demands of those closest to them. Individuals can't be removed far enough to be able to adequately affect the rights, the ends of these rights for individuals. It's already corrupted, because they'll look first to give more freedoms and the like to those that are closest to them. We expect that, right? But that's a failing of human nature. Your closest relatives, you're not going to wait. You guys got to wait in line because it's not fair. That's not the way it works. There's a certain amount of hypocrisy in all of this. So privatizing human rights, it's up to the individuals, becomes problematic. It's one of the reasons, one of the things that supports these institutions that are better off at doing this. Now, that doesn't mean they're not corruptible, right? It doesn't mean that those with more money can't influence those institutions to treat people differently, right? Because they do. They do treat people differently. You show up with your tax attorneys, the IRS is more likely to cut a deal, okay? So that's the first thing, right? That those closest to them are going to benefit, particularly members of their own family or immediate community. Individuals' ability to exercise their duties is, in large extent, determined by their own personal financial circumstances. That's the other part of this. What can they really do? The average person is working every day, trying to make a living. Are they really capable of, taking on this? That's why there's representative government. You guys take it on. We can't guarantee these things. I don't have time in my life to focus on that. All right. So these inequalities in the distribution of wealth fundamentally undermine the ability of those in poorer countries to reciprocate assistance provided them by those living in wealthier countries. In other words, you're going to be nationalistic. That's human nature. Take care of your own, right? That's what we hear. And is any nation going to say, well, I care about this poor nation, the downtrodden, that we got to help them. It may cost us, but we're going to help them. That's a tough thing to get to sell, because those in your own nation that aren't doing well are saying, take care of us. You're worried about them. We're part of this structure here. We're part of these political institutions. Why aren't you focusing on us? Right? Why are you helping that nation out? Is that a reasonable argument? I would argue that from the perspective of building adequate political structures to protect the rule of law and the like, their people's well-being, is an important responsibility. But how do you handle watching others in other countries suffer? Do you base how you use your resources on who's suffering more, or on who's sort of close to your family in terms of the national family? If you're poor living in America, you barely have enough to eat, and there are people in another country that barely have enough to eat, then what do? These are decisions that are not easy to make. We like to make them, but if you sit down and recognize there are limited resources, right? And so how you decide to use those will determine, sometimes in large measure, the rights people have and how they function. So national governments, right, are typically held to be primarily responsible for the adequate provisions of their own citizens' human rights, right? We built the institutions, we've put people in them, and we expect them to sort of represent us and take care of us. So the adequate protection then extend the idea of the promotion of everyone's human rights does require, right, as an example, more affluent and powerful nations providing sufficient assistance to those countries currently incapable of adequately ensuring the protection of their own citizens' basic human rights. In other words, and this is a fundamental question, if we don't use our resources to advance the rights of others elsewhere, does that have a negative impact in some way? How do we use our resources? And do we have a responsibility to protect those and ensure the rights of others in other countries when, circumstances or political structures do not? And it can take a lot of resources, military, economic, what have you. And do we want to spend our resources that way? So national and international institutions bear the primary responsibility of securing human rights, and the test for successfully fulfilling this responsibility is the creation of opportunities for all individuals to lead a minimally good life. So stop and think about that. Our government, whatever our government is, as your government, and governments of the other nations come together in the family of nations, and they have to work together as a international and international organizing political body to help deal with creating human rights everywhere. But still, under that circumstance, how much is your nation willing to contribute its national wealth to those organizations to help create human rights in other countries, or enforce them, or help them sort of move in that direction? How much of every country's right? So now the wealthier nations would contribute more. Does that mean they get more say? Are they going to create these other countries in their own image? Is that what they're hoping to do? Or are they hoping to globalize as a mechanism for bringing about equality? Or is that globalization really driven by elites to lower the barriers of entry into markets and to create more wealth for them? And will eventually those people in other countries not have an incremental increase in their human rights being protected or being developed, but they'll just be taken advantage of by these other institutions that have been set up? You can't legislate into the hearts and minds of people what is not there by nature or nurture, right? This is a hard concept, and because it's so fundamentally unfair. And we know now, right, that fairness is not the wellspring of all things that are created in terms of rights. We know it's unfair, but how do you correct it? How do you make people feel that even though we're a nation with our own governing bodies, we're responsible for all others and protecting and developing their human rights? It's a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult idea to not only get your mind around, but then figure out how you do it. Now, there are certain international organizations that focus on this, but I think we can all agree that they're relatively inadequate. They don't get the job done as we might expect they'll get it done, right? And it's understandable. They're going to have limited resources from these other nations. So we're fighting human nature here. Look, if we had a world of, resources that could never be depleted, right? Resources that we fundamentally have to, not divvy up because there are so many of them, right? Sorry, I'm just trying to keep this thing from rocking. If you think about that, think of the broader world. If there are resources everywhere, they're renewable, you can't use them up. Energy is just there. And we may get there someday technologically, but let's just say energy is there. Let's just say water, clean water is there. Let's say access to medical is there. Endless resources. There would still be those until you remove from human nature this greed, right, which is the fundamental element to human nature, and because it's driven by fear. If you don't remove that, somebody will say, yeah, it's a renewable resource or it's an endless resource, but if I can just get control of that, Think about China. Basically building more landmass in the ocean, creating more of its own territory. The human condition is the human condition, and any institution or any nation that doesn't recognize that and embrace that is fundamentally at a disadvantage, because that's the reality. When you're on the short end of the reality, you don't like the reality. And that's understandable, right? That you want those things delivered to you that others have. So this idea of a minimally good life, it almost sounds insulting. But that may be the best we're capable of doing, only because that minimal life costs less to deliver than a great life. In other words, the likelihood of us coming together internationally and even domestically, human rights dictate at its fundamental structure, it dictates that there be some sort of decent life for people. And that may be the best we provide. Maybe that's all we can provide, given our resources, given our disposition, given our greed, that we can feel enough for these people that have less, wherever they are, whatever the demographic is, and we say they've got to have more. And so we commit ourselves to that, right? We commit ourselves to that. The one thing we can do that doesn't take really vast resources, in my opinion, as I've looked at it, is education. Giving people, educating people, if they embrace it, if they understand the importance of it, really serves to begin to address these problems. You position more people outside those gates of fate, right? You take more people and help them live a better life, even if they don't get through, they're on the other side of it. And that's what we want. We want to know that people have that fundamental, those fundamentals in place. Now, we all want all this to go away. We want everyone to do well. We want no discrimination. We want no lack of opportunity. We want everyone to be treated with respect and care. And we want everyone to be supported by everyone else. I think that's what we would all want, right? Getting there is climbing a very steep mountain with a lot of rocks sort of rolling down on top of you. It's hard work and takes time. And again, it's understandable that people don't want to wait. You have one life. You want to be able to, enjoy that life to the best, to the fullest you can, and for your family and your children, and for those you know and love. You want no one to suffer. You want that rising tide lifts all boats. You want to make sure that's what happens, not just a few. All right, so let's just turn our attention now to philosophical justifications for human rights. Again, philosophy, back it up. Politics or political science is where philosophy and history and economics and sociology, science, it's where they all come together and the rubber meets the road. All of those things, those elements are critical to effectively acting politically, because politics is the means for change, right? It's the catalyst for change. But you have to be informed by all of these things. So I understand when you talk about philosophy, the idea is it helps you think about ideas, and it gives you input about ideas that you have to really then kind of chew on. Now, not everybody has the interest in doing it, obviously. Not everybody has the capacity to do it because their capacities are elsewhere. So it never seems very exciting to a lot of people, but it is important to put this in place and to be able to understand where these come from, rights, why they're important, what the shortfall is, how you make a better society to maximize these, know what these rights are, how we define them, how they're used, how you create them, how you protect them, and how you expand them, right? Not only in the quality and the number, but also across all of humankind. All right. So basically, philosophical justifications of human rights. Human rights originate as moral rights. We've talked about that. but that the successful passage of many human rights into international and national law enables one to think of human rights as, in many cases, both moral and legal rights. Why? The wellspring is moral rights, but the legal rights are the way in which we affect the ends of those things. Something just being right based on something does not carry much weight unless you can actively put that into motion, which means really legal rights. Legal rights are the manifestation of moral rights codified in such a way, right, that we can satisfy and provide a minimal, right, existence around these human rights, right? Human rights can either be claim rights or liberty rights, like we've talked about, and have negative or positive complexions in respect to the obligations imposed by others in securing the right. Human rights may be divided into 5 different categories. I'm not a big fan of this. And the principal object of securing human rights is the creation of the conditions for all individuals to have the opportunity to lead a minimally good life. Minimally good life. Keep that word in mind, minimally. Right? You say, well, what do you mean minimally? It means that there should be a foundation, a fundamental set of rights that guarantee people will live a good life. Can't guarantee a great life because of the things I've talked about, path to the present, in terms of genetics and all of that. And by the way, when I say genetics, I'm not saying that there's one group that has all the genetics that make them better than any other group. That's not the case. I'm talking about individuals that have certain genetic components that make them more likely to be musicians or athletes, right? Or plumbers, right? Or whatever. Not everyone or any particular group has all of these talents distributed amongst every single member. That's not the way this works. You get poor people in all kinds of groups. You get athletes from all different backgrounds, musicians from all different backgrounds. You get carpenters from different backgrounds. It comes down to the facts we've talked about before. Do not make the mistake of thinking that any one group of people possess all of these rights above everyone else. That's not the case. It could never be the case because of the fundamental things I've already laid out. What I'm talking about is that individuals have those things in place that help advance them in one field or another. Look, if you're born tone deaf, you couldn't carry a note on your back. You couldn't, someone could hum a melody or play a melody and you couldn't repeat it. You don't have the capacity, the musical capacity that others have. Why? Your brain is not structured to take in those notes and remember them or mimic them. In other words, sing them back. We don't know enough about the brain at all. We don't know where that comes from. We know it's there. If you ask great songwriters from whatever genre, doesn't matter, how they do it, they really can't tell you. It becomes this really obtuse explanation. Well, sometimes you sit there and you think you'll hear something in your head, and then, whoa, where are you hearing it from? I don't know. You hear it, and you think about it, and, you start putting pieces together, and you just know to go here with the melody, or go there, or do this, or say that. Use these words and not those words. Well, where do you get that from? Don't know. It's just there. It's how that brain that they have integrates. Other people can't come up with an idea. Those same people that are musicians can't maybe understand other arts. That's why it's hard to cross over, right? You get these musicians, they want to be actors that want to be musicians, and it doesn't usually carry over. It's very rare. One talent doesn't necessarily mean the other, which is my point. No one possesses it all. Okay. So human rights may be either claim rights or liberty rights. We've already talked about that. Human rights may be divided into those 5 different categories, which I'm not too fond of, with the principal object of securing human rights and the creation of the conditions for all individuals that have the opportunity to lead a minimally good life. Right. Finally, human rights are widely considered to trump other social and political considerations in the allocation of public resources. Resources. You can't have human rights if all the resources are placed in a smaller group, number-wise, of people, period. You can't certainly have human rights if you've got a dictator that has all the human rights along with their military supporters. So philosophers generally agree on such issues as the formal properties of human rights, the object of human rights, and the force of human rights. but we can't do anything about the resources. We can't do anything about the resources, which in its own way is especially discouraging, right? Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about different theories here, okay? The interest theory approach to this idea, right, of human rights and how those things are functionally put together, those rights. So advocates of interest theory approach argue that the principal function of human rights is to protect and promote certain essential human interests. So that's the interest theory says the purpose of those human rights are to protect and promote certain essential human interests. Essential human interests. How do you define that? Define what essential human interests are. We're right back to conjuring up that fundamentally, minimally good life. That's the one thing that should carry across all of human nature. All right, so securing human beings' essential interests is the principal ground upon which human rights may be morally justified. The interest approach is thus primarily concerned to identify the social and biological prerequisites for human beings leading a minimally good life. Interest approach is thus primarily concerned to identify the social and biological prerequisites for human beings leading minimally good life. Social and biological prerequisites. Define it. Try and define it. The universality of human rights is grounded in what are considered to be some basic, indispensable attributes for human well-being. Now we're getting somewhere, right? Basic, indispensable attributes for human well-being. We can start off with indispensable because that means protecting one's life and the fundamental rights that we get just by nature, right? We can get there. Which all of us are deemed necessarily to share. We can get there. Why? The key phrase here is basic, indispensable, right? Attributes of human well-being. We can talk about what makes human beings, conjures up well-being. We can talk about what's indispensable. You take it away and the whole thing collapses. We can talk about basic because they're fundamentally easy to say, well, freedom of speech. And then we can limit it and we can structure it, right? So the interest theory approach says, okay, this is to the interest of everyone, right? But that's not the only approach. Then there's the will theory approach. And in contrast to the interest approach, the will theory attempts to establish the philosophical validity of human rights under a single human attribute. Single human attribute. We're getting into dangerous territory here, right? And that is the capacity for freedom. Okay, we have to define what freedoms are and how those freedoms must be limited, because everyone can't have freedom to do whatever they would like. Because of limited resources and human nature, they would act in a certain way that would naturally limit the rights, the freedom of others. Look, in defense of human beings, we're the only entities on the planet that are aware of our condition. Right? We understand that we are on this little blue ball, spinning at an incredible speed, right? Rotating around this sun or thing that gives us warmth and light, and the whole mess, as we spin and as we rotate and as we orbit, is moving somewhere into this vast darkness. Okay? We don't know where we came from. Now I'm speaking scientifically. We don't know where we came from, how we got here, or what our purpose is. And we're scared because we know we're going to die. We know it's going to end. We're not, although we're structured like many other, in our case, mammals, we differ because of the size of our brains and our capacity to think. We make things. No matter what you say, they'll say, oh, this animal, that animal is intelligent. I have no doubt they are. But until they can land a spacecraft on the moon, there is a difference between our intellectual capacities and those very intelligent animals. Complex language is nice, but it has to produce something. Now, for all those animal activists out there, I'm not saying that animals are less important. What I am saying is we're more aware than they are, and that's frightening. And so we fear. And because we fear, we become greedy, especially since there are limited resources and we fear. So our condition is horrible in that sense, right? And we have to make the best of it. However we do that, right? Of course, now there seems to be more and more evidence that we are not alone, which makes sense just mathematically. When you think about billions and billions of stars, suns, and all these planets that go around them that we can see already, and there's got to be many more, there's going to be other life out there. We know that the human perspective, right, that things have a predictable size is incorrect, right? We know that. Things are not limited. The condition is not limited. In other words, because we see in our existence that we're on an Earth and it's one planet and that we have confined boundaries, right? We're convinced that that means everything is limited. But things that are limited are defined by things outside of them, right? If you're limited to a space, there must be a space around you. So what's around the limiting space that limits you? There must be something else. And there's something outside of that. And that would seem to have to go on for infinity. And we can't get our minds around infinity. Because everything we experience, right, is limited. We know that time is not real. We know that if you move faster through space, time slows down. You move slower through space, time speeds up. How can that be? Because time is manufactured by us. It doesn't really exist. It doesn't need to exist. We know so little, even about our own brains, that everything's a struggle. And there's a lot of fear attached to it. We're still struggling what are fundamental human rights for each of us. Think about that. We're still not there, right? We have things like poverty. We have things like young children dying in violence or at birth because they've got some illness and they're born in a poor country where you can basically treat that illness and that child would live, but it costs a dime and they don't have a dime. So there's a mother holding her child, watching her child die because they're short a dime. Should we give that dime? It seems like a no-brainer, right? But apparently people aren't. Now, I'm not saying that I'm a stellar human being here. This is about all of us. It's the collective, okay? All right, so basically, the will theory, again, in contrast to the interest approach, the will theory attempts to establish a philosophical validity of human rights upon a single human attribute, the capacity for freedom. How much freedom can we create? And how much can we work with in a way that doesn't take freedoms from others? The will theorists argue that what is distinctive about human agency is the capacity for freedom, and that this ought to constitute the core of any account of rights. What can we do with freedom? How do we use it? And where do those rights end? Because that's how we define what rights people have. I don't take yours, you don't take mine. Ultimately then, will theorists view human rights as originating in or reducible to a single constitutive right, or alternatively, a highly limited set of purportedly fundamental attributes around the capacity for freedom and the ability to control and limit where those things are. Okay, I want to talk about just one last thing, or two last things, sorry. One is this concept of relativism, moral relativism. So we're coming back to the whole moral, concept here. As moral principles and as moral doctrine, human rights are considered to be universally valid. Okay. However, moral universalism has long been subject to criticism by so-called moral relativists. Moral relativists argue that universally valid moral truths do not exist. There are no moral absolutes here. For moral relativists, there is simply no such thing as universally valid moral doctrine. Relativists view morality as a social and historical phenomenon. What we come to think of as rights is relative to that historical, past to the present, and the social constructs we come up with. Moral beliefs and principles are therefore thought of as socially and historically contingent, valid only for those cultures and societies in which they originate and within which they are widely approved. This throws a monkey wrench into the whole works. You can't really step beyond those cultural and historical barriers. What's moral, and everything is built on that, right, to get to human rights, is really subject to the structure of that individual nation or what have you, based on its historical and social, structures and phenomena. Relativists point to the vast array of diverse moral beliefs and practices apparent in the world today as empirical support for their position. Even within a single and contemporary society such as the United States or Great Britain, one can find a wide diversity of fundamental moral beliefs, principles, and practices. In other words, there are separations that are givens, that are structurally in it. They're already in the mix, and you can't get them out. And so that's problematic. But nothing says we can't find commonalities. There's nothing here that says there's no commonalities. And as we build international organizations, we can attach those attendant nations to that idea and create a diverse morality that encompasses all of that. That's my, when we think about moral relativism, it's not necessarily, a dead end, right? All right. Last thing, epistemological criticisms of human rights. Second most important contemporary philosophical form of human rights criticism challenged the presumed objective basis of human rights as moral rights, that the connection of those two things. That's what a challenge is. Think about the relativists. They're saying moral rights are different. Here they're saying that there may not be a connection, right? A connection between the objective of basic human rights as moral rights. Moral principles and concepts are inherently subjective in character. On this view, moral beliefs do not emanate from a correct determination of a rationally purposive will or even gaining insight into the will of some divine being. Rather, moral beliefs are fundamentally expressions of individuals' partial preferences. This position therefore rejects the principal ground upon which the concept of moral rights rests, that there exists rational and a priori moral principles upon which a correct and legitimate moral doctrine is to be founded. Now think about where we ended up here, right? It seems in a confused state. But we're arguing about this. So if you take all this in sum, here's what we get from this particular reading. And I'm quoting now. Human rights have become indispensable to the contemporary understanding of how human beings should be treated by one another and by national and international political bodies. Human rights are best thought of as potential moral guarantees for each human being to lead minimally good life. The extent to which this aspiration has not been realized represents a gross failure by the contemporary world to institute a morally compelling order based upon human rights. The philosophical basis of human rights has been subjected to consistent criticism. While some aspects of the ensuing debate between philosophical supporters and opponents of human rights remain unresolved and perhaps irresolvable, the general case for human rights remains a morally powerful one. Arguably, the most compelling motivation for the existence of human may rest upon the exercise of imagination. Try imagining a world without human rights. Think about where we ended up. We've tried hours now to come to a better understanding of what human rights are, where they come from, how they get applied, what the problems might be. And we've come to is, listen, we have failed miserably. But we know the world is better with it, human rights in place, than without it. So we have to keep at it. It is inescapable for the human condition, even if we're talking about leading minimally good lives, to ignore this. It can't be ignored. It's difficult to resolve. It's hard to define. It's hard to enforce, but we have no choice if we all want to guarantee that we'll have a minimally good life. Think about the beginning of the class. I talked about sort of the brain in the jar, right? Approach to things, right? Think about the idea, in economic theory of justice, Rawls. Think about the veil of ignorance, which is my version, the veil of ignorance, brains in a jar is my version of the veil of ignorance. If we all didn't know who we were, but we knew that once we came up with a system, right, the veil would be lifted, or our brains would be put into bodies, and we would see who we were, what race we were, what time we were born in, what genetic dispositions we had, or predispositions we had. We'd see it all. What would we want to do? We'd want to get rid of those things which make our lives less enjoyable, less productive, right, of less value to us. And we want to protect ourselves from others taking those away. That is the fundamental premise upon which we are trying to build an understanding of human rights. If we could do that, if we could all, come to a place where we agree on that, we'd be much better off, right? So now the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I'm taking that out of any religious context. If we treated others the way we wanted to be treated, without manipulation, without failure, the world would be a better place. We don't do that for the reasons that we've talked about. So now we're stuck trying to fix it. And that's the place at which we find ourselves at this juncture. Okay, that ends this lecture. Expect another one next Monday, and we're moving towards finishing up for that midterm, and there'll be a review so you know exactly what terms and concepts you should be aware of. Read all those things which are assigned. This is the foundation of what's going to happen after the midterm.